I'm going to start the questions with kind of going a kind of very deep, if I may. Stephen. So, and I know that now watching you do not have a thought to any of these places that I'm going to ask you to go to. So, first of all, I have to ask you, is it okay to ask these deep questions?
Yes.
Yeah? Okay. So, prepare for that. So, a question that came up is, what was it like to be so long in solitary confinement, and how did that affect your mental state, and how did you take care of your mental state in that situation?
That's a great question. It's very relevant. Horrendous is the word I always use. Torturous, is another close one. Really, I used to call it the 7 levels of hell. Would really do it justice. But when it's an interesting thing, because a long-term prisoner is defined as doing 5 years or over. As doing 5 years or over. What is really key here is that if you think when you come into prison, and it's like Groundhog Day, so every day is pretty much the same, so you go on and on and on in this no man's land, of horrendous thing, getting filled with horrendous feelings and all that. So, as a human being, what you tend to do, what we do to make yourself feel better, is you will be nostalgic about good things, lovely things, people you love, times you would have had. But what's funny is that after a few years, you realise. You realise that the world has moved on, and really you have no new memories to create for that vacuum, which is an unbelievable place to be. I mean, I used to walk around them places feeling like every bit of emotion had been sucked out of me, literally, like The Walking Dead. So, and in solitary, it's interesting to what I do now, with the filmmaking and stuff, is, all I really had was a book, a pen and paper. I wrote my first novel in there. I learned how to write. I self-educated from that. I had a thirst for knowledge, and I used to do that. That's why.
So, question for you, Carl. Do you think that it would work if the accused and the accuser was put in a room to talk instead of being in a courtroom? Do you think that would work, knowing what you know?
It's like a socio-political question. Well, there is such a thing called restorative justice, where, for lower levels of crime, we have tried this. We have tried this with lower level domestic violence, lower level, and we've tried this with lower level assaults, tried this with things, the awful things sometimes that happens at schools, which is saddening that those kind of things are happening in our schools. So I think it certainly works at a lower level, and the results that we got back from this across the country were really positive. I've heard stories of where, there's been a murder, and the family of the victim have met with the perpetrator of the violence. And do you know what? Behind every single murder, there's a different story. Some are premeditated, just awful, ruthless murders. Some are ridiculous mistakes that shouldn't have occurred. So I think it really is on a case-by-case merit, as far as I'm concerned. We really have to look at what's happened, why it's happened, what was in the mindset, what we call the mens rea, what was the level of mens rea, the guilty intent of the offending party, before we can ever reach some kind of a resolution. I would hate to say that carte blanche Yes, you can put a criminal and a victim together in a room and expect miracles. Unfortunately, the world doesn't work like that, but there is a process that we need to work through. And as Steve, I just want to pick up on a point that Steve made. You know, over the many years that he was in prison and the many years that he was in solitary confinement, it took that many years for him to come to a realization within himself. So to expect it to happen overnight just by putting a victim and an offender together, I think is unrealistic in most situations, but it can happen over a period of time. Why not have a victim and an offender meet each other several years after and say, this is how you affected my life. This is what's happened as a consequence of you doing what you did. And maybe even the offender talking about their past. Because most people get into a cycle of behavior because of things that have happened in their past. It's what we call conditioning. But I'm a firm believer that your past should not dictate who you are today, and certainly should not lay the foundation stones of your future.
Thank you. Oh, Carl, that's great. So next question. Stephen, with your internal frameworks, what kind of thing are you keeping in, and how are you keeping them in, and how do you create a framework?
Another good question. You know, I always really get to it with these questions, you know me, you know, and I really answer it, you know, from my experience and my angle to it of what and, you know, I mean, I love people. You know, anyone who knows me, knows my work, they know that. They know I go over and beyond for people, for humanity, for groups of people, for equality, for all these values, and I'm very courageous to the fact. But, you know, I know that human beings have some not nice stuff in them, you know, really. You know, I know that. And there's no judgment there. There's no right or wrong to this. It just is. You know, it's part of the decoding to facilitate the growth of it, really. I suppose this is the easy way to say it. Therein lies the paradox and the dilemma of, you know, of understanding oneself. So that's the thing, really. You know, is that. You know, in this tapestry of human conditioning, there's always room for improvement in some areas, no matter where we are or how we are, and this is the thing. So it is about containing the saboteur, sometimes, you know, it can be named. You know, we talk a lot about archetypes, don't we? And we work a lot from different archetypes. And, you know, one of them, you know, is the saboteur. And, yeah, you know, so that is the reason why, just to check. And in some kind of sense, it's like a remote viewing. I can be up here watching me. This is a kind of surveillance, you know, that I'm at sometimes, really, you know. So I'm not missing anything. And that's for obvious reasons. But, you know, the frameworks are learnings, all of them painful, which have been tried and tested and pushed and pulled, and I know I have took them apart and know that they are the best way forward. Not for me. One of the ways to know that it's going in the right direction is it's not an I, it's a we. And that, you know, and I build them and I populate that only with the same stuff that I know that can integrate with that in the right way. And I sidestep or use whatever I do to realise, understand, and stay away from other stuff that isn't healthy to that. If that helps.
Thank you, Stephen. I think I'd like to add something here a little bit about these frameworks that Stephen's talking about, because the thing is, you know, all sorts of things can happen to, well, all sorts of things happen to all of us, and there'll be people in the room tonight where they're having terrible difficulties, and we can all get triggered by things, and, you know, sometimes it takes mindfulness, and I think that also faith and prayer helps as well in these situations. But I also think by working and living with someone who has such strict frameworks, I think it's also very important to empower the people that you love and empower them and respect their boundaries. As I think sometimes in this world people can be selfish without realizing they're being selfish. So just take 2 more minutes just to think, just maybe give someone a little bit more space, or maybe instead of putting an opinion, perhaps ask a question. So I think for me working and being in this world of peace, change, past, present, 2 extremes, it's a constant journey of having to stay awake and really be careful about what you're thinking and saying and doing. And I think that also helps bring change, to all be more mindful. Now I've got a question for Kul, and this is a question from the audience. When did you meet Stephen, and was there any difficulties? Was there any ooh-ah moments?
Actually, somebody in the audience has warmed me up to this question already and asked me this question. And I was very honest then. I'll be very honest with you now. So I met Stephen when I was speaking at an event in London. It was a very exclusive event, a very select audience from all around the world. And we were talking about the future, and I was talking about the future of leadership. Now, on that day, a lot of the ladies here won't understand this, but let me just say this. On that day, I had man flu. And it's a good job you ladies are immune to man flu, because it's a killer. I could think of nothing else but to get back into my car to drive my weary way back to Derby. And as I was getting out of I can't even remember where it was, Stephen. It was a lovely building in London. And I just heard these footsteps behind me, and I thought, oh no, somebody's calling me back in now. And it was Stephen. And Stephen told me his story, and he said, he told me his backstory, and he said, we really need to work together. I really connect with you. I resonate with what you're saying. And I was like, man flu. I was like, yeah, okay. We swapped details. And I'll be honest, for the next couple of months, I was like, I'm not sure. And the police officer side of me kicked in, and I thought, there was a point in my life where, as a senior detective, I was involved in counterterrorism, and I was involved in all the top secret stuff that you can imagine, working with MI5 Special Branch, and I was director of intelligence, and we were chasing people like Stephen, around the country, and he was what we would call an organized crime group. And did I really want to get involved with somebody who was at that level? And I then had to live by my own principle that I teach, that your past doesn't create your present, and it isn't your foundation for the future. So I had to do some reframing in my own mindset, and I thought to myself, well, you can't be saying that to other people if you're not practicing it. So consequently, Stephen and I actually started talking seriously, and I'm glad we did, because look at the magic that we're creating now wherever we go. And I just think that we're going to do so much more to change the way people think, to overcome some of the limitations that we hold in our own mindset, the prejudice that we carry around with us, and we all have it. And this is about, if we truly want a society, if we truly want a world that is full of love, we have to challenge prejudice in all of its forms.
Thank you, Kul. Okay, question for you, Stephen. What did you actually do to become a Cat A person?
Lifting that sweet.
Yeah, not picking that litter up was terrible. I really took a dim view of that. No, it was I kind of progressed really, but it was armed robbery. I went to prison for, and it was firearms and stuff like that, and it was, a lot of this surveillance, counter-surveillance stuff, and because I was. It's hard to say the word unlucky, that's the wrong word when you're talking about family, because family are family. But I kind of grew up, and there was people in my family that was very central in stuff, and this was the being brought into that way of doing things, and looking at the world. So then, so.
I think from listening to very many of the stories from both gentlemen, I think that as the more I hear that it's very, very important who young people are around. So when you have young lads of 9, 10, 11, 12, you know, who are they? Who are they? Who are those little boys growing into young men, and who is around them? And it's good also, as Kul was saying before about community, you know, everyone's got eyes and ears and a mouth, and to talk with love. And if you see any young person who could be potentially groomed into crime, then it's a good idea to speak up. Now, we had a lovely question from the audience. What can mothers do to prevent crime? What can they do? Because they are the mothers of sons, you know. So what can they do? What can they do so their sons aren't groomed or they're wayward or whatever? So I'd like you to unpack this between you, if you may.
Why is all the responsibility on mothers? That's my first question. Because, you know, sorry? It should be parents. You know, it might take 5 seconds of joy to create a child, or whatever it takes, but a child is born, supposedly born into a loving relationship with two parents. And, you know, one of the things that we need to challenge here is the role of each of the parents. You know, we've got sucked up into this language of having housewives and house husbands. And my question is, why should we have those titles? Why do these labels even exist? So we have a mother, we have a father, both are parents, and both have a responsibility to guide their child. We even guide our kittens, believe it or not. I try to teach my kitten values. It doesn't work, but I try. And it won't work with your children all the time, but we try. And that is what we can do. We can try. We can constantly try. We can not give up. We can persevere. We can continue. And we try until our voice is hoarse. But that is our responsibility as parents. We constantly try. We try until they get to 20. We try until they get to 30. We constantly try, but we patiently wait for them to make the mistakes that they need to make in order for them to learn. I have made 1,000 mistakes in my life. I could spend all night here. If you've got time, I will stay all night here and tell you about all the mistakes I've ever made in my life. But the important thing is that they've got someone to go back to and learn from those mistakes. And we're the sounding board in many ways. That's I see as a role of parents. But collectively, as a community, we have a responsibility to create a community where any parent can go to any child and give them guidance.
Yeah, absolutely, Kul. I mean, my answer to this is, you know, it's very easy to. It's not complicated, and it is, you know, these pigeonholing, you know, these names and these stereotypes. I think it's unhelpful, but absolutely so. But you know, let's be really frank about it. You know, it's a shared responsibility here. You know, and it's very clear. You know, I was just out there earlier on, and you know, I was talking to a young lad there, and I was asked the same question, didn't I? You know, and you know, one of the things is that I've learned that real change comes when people come together. When they come together, you know, and they share the same values and same vision, and they work hard towards the same goals. I mean, it really is as easy as that. You know, and if you want some really short advice, you know, I said this out there, is stay away from negative, unhealthy influences. Rather be by yourself. It's really as simple as that. Populate your life with the right people. Good idea is people who are just a little bit more further than you. And if you want the real succinct answer, it's really easy. Always do the next right thing, no matter how hard that may be. And it usually is. And I said to you, didn't I? If you have a conflict or you're unsure about certain choices that are presented to you, ask someone who you know, like your mother, who would never put you the wrong way, and ask them. and they'll give you the answer.
Just had a very amusing thought. I thought, well, that question about mothers is to fathers. So I'm going to answer that question, if I may. Yeah? So what can mothers do to protect their sons? They can start at a very early age telling them wonderful stories. And they can start by empowering their little men to be little men, and to, in the storytelling, show them where the role models are. And ask these little men questions and find out who they are. Because what I see over and over again, so many broken, hurt little children that have had other people's conditioning put on them. They were never asked, what do they like, what do they feel, what would they like to be? And I think that when you actually discover a child's nature, and then you can start guiding them. And another thing mothers can do, they can be nice to themselves and to each other, and also not be afraid to speak up and be strict. Not be afraid to say, well, when the little boy says, oh, but my friends are doing it, be bold and say no, because a lot of mothers have a lot of stress for many reasons. Now, this brings us on to another social problem that we have, which is a lot of mothers are single. And a lot of the guys are suffering because they don't see their children too. So the thing is, I do believe in empowering men. I think men are wonderful things. So I encourage the women to empower their men so the men can look after the women. And this is where it begins. Anyway, let's get on to more questions. Okay. Okay, the next question to Kul and to Stephen. I'd like Kul to go first. So this is a question that goes like this. There is a very, very wise gentleman in the room that believes that all humans are born good. And when a human is born, that baby is good. So when a person, because girls can be naughty as well as boys, they can also end up as, categories, whatever. What happens? Is it conditioning from education? So would education, if all boys or girls were educated in the right way, would they make wrong choices and become criminals? Or is it something else?
Quite simply, the wise person has got it right. We're born from love, we're born into love, and we're born of love. And love is the singular thing that surrounds us when we are born, in the vast, vast majority of cases. So what happens? What goes wrong after that? Well, just think about it. We're born into a family that tells us what our values are based upon the values that they were taught, and they were taught, and they were taught through generations behind. We're then sent to school. And school tells us what's right and what is wrong. And we're brought up in this culture of accepting that competition against your neighbor is a normality. We're then going into university, and we then go into the workspace. And we go into the workspace where, again, new sets of values are surgically implanted into our mind. And again, this message around competition and you need to be better than the next person is drilled into us even further. We go into business, and every business consultant that you ever come across says, look at your competition, compete with other people. Well, I don't compete with anybody. I literally do not compete with anybody. I'm a coach, I'm a leadership coach. There are thousands of other leadership coaches, but I have grown my business over the last 3 years without competing. And if we now understand that we don't need to compete, that we don't need to be conditioned by all of this messaging that we've had, the stories that we've been told over eons from the moment that we can get to a point of comprehensibility, if we can switch off television and stop looking at the news and stop reading newspapers that popularize these messages that have been thrown at us time and time and time again. Switch on the news, you'll only ever hear bad news. The best dramas that you watch, whether it's EastEnders, Coronation Street, Emmerdale Farm, whatever it is to you, the best episodes are those where there's tragedy. What is that telling us about humanity? That we thrive on tragedy? That we get excited about something that we should be sad about? That, ladies and gentlemen, for me is conditioning. And that is what we need to break away from. This is a matrix that we need to leave and start dehypnotizing ourselves and living our lives in accordance with our own principles, our own values, and actually finding our fourth quadrant, what I call my fourth quadrant, the hidden potential that we have inside of us. Because until we break away from this, we can't dig down to that level. And when we dig down to that level, that's when the true magic happens.
Thanks, Kul. Yeah, I absolutely agree again, really. And in my book, I have a whole chapter on this because this was my experience. And this was the key to all, well, it was definitely pivotal to unlocking and jumping forward in the right direction. As I said, it's unraveling the lies, you know. Because of this conditioning and, you know, the way we're taught to think, or the, you know, the views that are perpetrated, you know, upon us to be a certain way and look a certain way and act in a certain way and do all this stuff, when really we are all powerful human beings. You know, and the competitive is really interesting because the opposite of that is the creative. And I've always known that. In many cases, a lot of it is unwitting. What is, you know, from father to son, grandfather, and down. It's not, there's no right or wrong here. And there is a duality to all things anyway. But it's about what we have in us and unlocking that in the right ways, guided by the right people. You know, and our uniqueness and our individuality is immense. It really is immense. And there is a very forceful and strategic push to not give people that for many certain reasons, which we won't go into. But, you know, I mean, we are creators. I've always said this. It's important to remember that we are creators. If we make a dinner, we create. If we form a business, we create. We get up in the morning, we make our bed, we create. If a woman has a beautiful child, she is a creator. You know, the real answers are within us.